My daughter has been mentally unstable since she was a teenager. My own mother said that. In open court, while wearing my dead grandmother's pearl earrings. My name is Clara Thorne. I'm 33 years old. My mother Eleanor walked out when I was 14. No note, no goodbye. The woman who raised me instead was my grandmother, Dorothy. She gave me everything: her home, her patience, her belief that I could be something. When Dorothy died, she left me her estate. $450,000. That's when Eleanor came back. Not to grieve, to collect. She came with a new husband, Arthur Sterling, a man with a long history of targeting vulnerable seniors, and a plan. Have me declared legally incompetent. Seize Dorothy's inheritance before I could touch it. She froze my bank accounts. Got me suspended from my job. Stood in that courtroom and called me unstable. I sat there and said nothing. Eleanor's attorney finished his statement. He had listed my name, my age, my so-called history of instability. The judge, silver hair, reading glasses at the end of her nose, had heard it all. Then she set her pen down and looked at him carefully. Counsel, do you actually know what this woman does for a living? He blinked, checked his notes. He had no idea. Neither did my mother until that moment. Because I am a forensic fraud examiner. 11 years finding the lies people hide inside financial records. Elder financial abuse. Forged documents. Stolen estates. And Dorothy had known exactly who I was. That's why, before she died, she hid a journal and a brass key where only I would find them: every transaction. Every forged signature, every theft, recorded in her own hand. She couldn't stop Eleanor alone. But she knew I could. My mother's face went pale in about 3 seconds. The day I took that witness stand, I was done being quiet. Before we go any further, please hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. If you give this a like, good luck is coming your way. Milwaukee in November had a particular way of making itself known. The cold came in off Lake Michigan like a second presence in the room, not hostile exactly, but insistent, the kind of cold that reminded you to pay attention. Clara Thorne paid attention to everything. It was, in a way, her whole profession. Her office on the 4th floor of a gray stone building on West Wisconsin Avenue was exactly the kind of space that reflected its occupant: orderly without being sterile, precise without being cold. The filing cabinet drawers were labeled in her own careful handwriting. Her desktop held 3 monitors arranged at identical angles, a ceramic mug that read, "In God We Trust." All others must submit audit reports, and a framed photograph of her grandmother Dorothy, taken at a church picnic sometime in the 90s. Dorothy was laughing in the picture, her white hair catching the summer light, a slice of watermelon in her hand, and pure, uncomplicated joy settled deep into every line of her face. Clara kept that photograph where she could see it easily. Not because she needed reminding, she never needed that, but because some days the work got heavy. Not emotionally heavy in any way she would ever admit to her colleagues, but the cases she handled had a particular weight to them. Elder financial abuse, Medicare fraud, the slow, deliberate theft from people who had spent their entire lives building something, only to have it dismantled quietly and without mercy in their most vulnerable years. The cases came across her desk in neat manila folders, but inside those folders were people. Savings accounts drained to zero. Reverse mortgages signed under duress. Pension funds redirected to accounts the account holder had never heard of, accounts with names like shell companies formed on a Tuesday in Delaware. With no physical address and no employees and nothing behind them but intention. Clara Thorne was 33 years old, and she was very good at her work. Better than good, if she was being honest with herself, and she had spent her entire adult life building the habit of honesty. The way other people built collections deliberately, piece by piece, because she had decided early on that accuracy was the only thing in the world she could fully rely on. Her supervisor, Gerald Reardon, called her the best forensic fraud examiner on the regional Medicare team. And he had called her that in meetings, in front of other people, which was the kind of endorsement that meant something. She accepted these compliments the same way she accepted most things in her life. With a brief nod and a mental note to continue doing exactly what she was already doing. Her pill organizer sat at the edge of her desk, filled for the week in precise compartments. Her case files were organized not just by date but by a color-coded cross-reference system she had developed herself. One that Gerald had twice asked her to write up as a departmental protocol. And that she had twice politely declined, because the system existed in her mind as much as on paper and she was not entirely sure it could survive translation. Outside her window, Milwaukee moved through its Tuesday morning routine. A city bus hissed to a stop 2 floors below. Somewhere in the building's ventilation system, a heating unit was making a sound like a quiet, ongoing sigh. The Medicare fraud case. She was working a durable medical equipment supplier in Wauwatosa, whose billing patterns were wrong in the specific, almost elegant way billing patterns go wrong when someone believes they are being clever. Had been sitting in her active file for 6 days. The supplier had been billing for power wheelchairs for beneficiaries who lived in third-floor walk-up apartments with no elevator access. The methodology was not new, it was barely creative. But it was consistent, which meant it was a habit, and habits left trails, and trails were what Clara was good at following. She had been at her desk since 7:30. She had the Medicare billing extracts printed and arranged in a 2-column comparison on her desk. And she was annotating the discrepancies in her precise, small handwriting when the certified mail arrived at 11:14 in the morning. Denise from the front desk brought it up personally. That alone was unusual. Clara signed for it without looking at the return address, finished the margin note she was writing in her case file, capped her pen, and then picked up the envelope and turned it over. The return address read Hartley, Sims and Kowalski, attorneys at law. 5120 North Port Washington Road, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 53217. She set the envelope down. Picked up her coffee lukewarm already, because she always let it sit too long, and drank what remained of it. Then she picked up the envelope again, because something at the outer edge of her attention had snagged on that law firm name, a thread of recognition she could not quite pull into focus. Hartley, Sims and Kowalski. She had seen that name before. Not on a Medicare case. Somewhere else. She sat with it for a moment, and then she opened the envelope. The document inside was a formal legal notice. A petition contesting the last will and testament of Dorothy May Thorne, deceased, of Eau Claire County, Wisconsin. The petition had been filed by one Eleanor Vance. Clara's hands went still. She read the name again. Eleanor Vance. Eleanor Ruth Vance, née Thorne. The woman who had packed a single suitcase on a Tuesday afternoon in September, 19 years ago. When Clara was 14 years old, and walked out the door of their apartment in Green Bay without looking back. No argument, no discussion, not even a note on the kitchen counter. Just gone, the way weather shifts suddenly and without explanation, and with no apparent concern for what was left behind. There had been no birthday card in 19 years. No phone call when Clara graduated from the University of Wisconsin, or when she passed her CFE examination. Or when Dorothy had her hip replaced and spent 3 weeks in a rehabilitation facility and would have appreciated, more than anyone knew, having her daughter make the drive from wherever she had settled. None of those things had prompted contact. A contested will, apparently, had. Clara read the petition through twice. 3 pages of professional legal language, the kind that costs money by the hour. Eleanor was claiming that Dorothy's final will signed 14 months before her death was the product of undue influence. Specifically, that Clara had manipulated her elderly grandmother into altering the document in her favor. The estate was valued at $450,000, representing primarily the equity in Dorothy's home in Eau Claire and a life insurance policy. Dorothy had been dutifully paying premiums on for 32 years. Clara placed the papers on her desk. She looked at the return address one more time, and the thread in her mind finally pulled free and gave her what she was looking for: Arthur Sterling. 3 years ago, a referral from the Wisconsin Department of Financial Institutions. A complaint regarding a small business operator in Racine who had been named in 2 separate elder financial abuse inquiries. The cases had stalled when both complainants withdrew, but she had noted the name of his legal representative in the file. Hartley, Sims and Kowalski. Arthur Sterling was Eleanor's husband. Clara had seen the marriage announcement in the county records 18 months ago. In the course of a background check she had run on Arthur for an unrelated inquiry. She had noted it then as an unfortunate coincidence and moved on. She was not moving on now. She looked at the photograph of Dorothy laughing at the church picnic, white hair bright in the summer light, watermelon in hand, joy written all over her face. The room was very quiet. The heating unit in the ventilation system gave its long, tired exhalation. Outside, the city continued its morning without interruption. "I thought you were dead," Clara said quietly, to the envelope. Her voice was perfectly steady. Her hands were not. She noticed the legal notice was slightly creased at the corner where her grip had tightened without her deciding to tighten it. Her coffee mug had left a faint ring on the envelope's flap. She smoothed the envelope carefully, placed it on the left side of her desk, where she kept items requiring follow-up action, and looked at Dorothy's photograph one final time. Then she uncapped her pen and returned to the Medicare billing anomaly in Wauwatosa. The numbers were patient. They always were. But the certified mail sat on the left side of her desk for the remainder of that afternoon. And no amount of deliberate focus could make her stop feeling it there the way you feel barometric pressure dropping before a storm reaches you, that unmistakable atmospheric shift that tells you, with perfect clarity, that something is already in motion. The office smelled of old paper and the cooling ghost of morning coffee. Clara's pen moved across the page with its usual precision. The heating unit sighed. The seed had been planted, and the ground around it was already beginning to change. The call from her bank came on a Thursday morning, 1 week after the certified mail arrived. Clara was at her desk early. She was always at her desk early with a fresh cup of coffee and a new case file open in front of her when her cell phone buzzed with a number she recognized as the fraud department of her bank. She answered it expecting a routine security verification. She got something else entirely. The preliminary court order had been filed 2 days ago. Her checking and savings accounts had been frozen pending the resolution of the competency proceeding. The representative on the phone was professionally apologetic in that particular way. That means the institution is sorry for your situation while being entirely clear that the situation is not their problem. Clara thanked him and ended the call and sat for a moment looking at the wall. She opened her laptop and pulled up her bank portal. The accounts were flagged with a legal hold notification. The balance in her checking account, the money she used for rent and groceries and gas, and the modest savings she had been building since she was 24 years old, was inaccessible. The savings account was the same. She had $7.32 in a PayPal account she'd almost forgotten she owned. That was the sum total of her liquid financial life for the foreseeable future. She pressed her palms flat against the surface of her desk. The mahogany was cool under her hands, and solid, and she needed something solid right then. She breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth the way she had taught herself to do years ago, when she was a teenager in a 1-bedroom apartment in Green Bay. Learning how to be steady in conditions that didn't support steadiness. She pulled up her most recent Social Security statement, the one Dorothy had helped her set up an account to access years ago. Back when online government portals were new and Dorothy had thought the whole thing was magic. Looking at it now, in the context of a frozen bank account and a legal challenge to her mental competency, the document felt less like a record of her work history and more like a portrait of a life that someone was methodically trying to dismantle. She closed the laptop and opened the file she had started on the Thorne estate matter. She had not been idle in the week since the legal notice arrived. She had pulled court records, property records, the probate filing for Dorothy's estate, and every piece of publicly accessible documentation she could find on Eleanor Vance and Arthur Sterling. What she had was not yet a complete picture, but it was enough to know that the frame was deeply, deliberately wrong. The apartment she returned to each evening was quiet in a way that felt different now from its usual quiet. She had always appreciated the orderliness of a space that was entirely her own, the single coffee mug in the rack, the bookshelves organized by subject, the absence of the ambient clutter of other people's habits. But there was a version of solitude that was chosen and comfortable. And then there was a version that had been enforced by a frozen bank account and a suspended professional credential, and those two versions felt different in the body. Sitting in a chair at 10 o'clock at night with a case file on the kitchen table and the November wind off the lake pressing against the window glass. The EOB arrived in the afternoon mail. Explanation of benefits, Medicare. Dorothy May Thorne, beneficiary. It listed a surgical procedure, a left hip arthroplasty dated 8 months before Dorothy's death. Clara read it twice, and then a third time, and then she sat very still for a long moment. Dorothy Thorne had broken her right hip in 2021 and had the surgery to repair it. Her left hip had been stiff and aching for the last 2 years of her life. Bad enough that stairs were difficult and long walks were out of the question, but not bad enough for surgery. Dorothy had been phobic about hospitals since 1987, when her husband Harold had gone in for what was supposed to be a routine appendectomy and never come home. She would sooner have walked on a bad hip for the rest of her natural life than checked herself into a surgical suite voluntarily. Clara knew this the way she knew the sound of Dorothy's voice and the smell of her kitchen as a fact so foundational it did not require confirmation. Dorothy had not had that surgery. The claim had been filed for a procedure that had never occurred. And the provider listed on the claim was a medical supply and services company called Lakeshore Health Partners, LLC. Registered in the state of Wisconsin in 2022. Clara had that name in her notes already. It appeared in the background file she'd built on Arthur Sterling, listed as one of 3 limited liability companies he had formed in the last 6 years. Alongside a commercial laundry operation in Racine and a wellness consulting firm that appeared to have no clients and no physical address. This doesn't add up, Clara said aloud, to no one, to the empty office, to the fluorescent light humming steadily above her. Dorothy hated hospitals. Her heart was moving faster than she wanted it to. And she made herself slow it down by thinking through what she actually knew in sequence, the way she thought through every case. A fraudulent Medicare claim for a surgery that never happened. A power of attorney document that had been used to access Dorothy's accounts in the last year of her life, filed by Eleanor Vance. Arthur Sterling's history of involvement with elder financial accounts that went sideways. A law firm connecting all of them. She was reaching for the phone to call her contact at the state's Medicaid Fraud Control Unit when Gerald Reardon knocked on her office doorframe and came in without waiting for an answer. Which he never did, and stood in front of her desk with an expression on his face that she had never seen there before. He was a composed man. Ordinarily 30 years in federal oversight work had given him a particular equanimity. The ability to receive bad news without visible reaction, and the expression he was wearing now, which was neither composed nor equanimous, told her before he spoke a word that what he was about to say was not going to be procedural. He sat down across from her, which he also almost never did, and put both hands on the arms of the chair, and said her name. "Clara," he said, "I need you to hear this from me directly, and I need you to know that I am personally just hear it." The Human Resources notification had come from the department's legal counsel that morning. In light of the pending court proceeding regarding Clara's legal competency, she was being placed on administrative leave with pay, effective immediately, pending the resolution of the matter. She was not to access case files remotely. She was not to contact Medicare providers in connection with any open investigations. Her credentials had been temporarily suspended. The silence that followed lasted long enough for the heating unit to complete one of its long, tired sighs. "Gerald," she said. "I know," he said. "I know, Clara. I went to bat. I told them what I know about you, which is everything, and it didn't. The legal exposure is they couldn't." "It's all right," she said. It was not all right. She said it because she needed to end the conversation before something cracked that she could not afford to crack. After Gerald left, Clara sat in her office for a long time without moving. The case file on the Lakeshore Health Partners billing anomaly was still open on her desk. The EOB was beside it. The bank notification was still up on her laptop screen. She looked at the photograph of Dorothy, laughing at the picnic, full of summer and watermelon and uncomplicated joy. She gripped the edge of her mahogany desk until she could feel the wood grain pressing into her palm. The numbers on her laptop screen had gone slightly soft at the edges, not because her eyes were failing but because something else was happening. Something she refused to name, something she blinked hard against twice and then was done with. "I am not the broken child she left behind." The thought came to her plainly, without drama, the way true things tend to arrive. She was not 14 years old in a Green Bay apartment anymore. She was not the girl who had waited by the window for 3 days before she accepted that Eleanor was not coming back. She was a forensic fraud examiner with 11 years of professional experience and a working knowledge of every mechanism by which people used legal and financial systems to take things from other people that did not belong to them. Eleanor Vance had chosen the wrong daughter to come after. She spent the drive home thinking through what she knew and what she still needed to know. The two lists running parallel in her mind with the familiar clarity of an active case. What she knew: the power of attorney was suspicious. The Medicare billing was fraudulent. Arthur Sterling had been connected to at least 2 prior elder financial abuse complaints. What she still needed: the notary records. The full transaction history. The chain of custody on Dorothy's signature. She had been building these kinds of cases for 11 years. She knew how to build them. The difference was that this time, the case file had her grandmother's name on it, and her own. Clara closed her laptop. She gathered the EOB, the probate documents, and the background file on Arthur Sterling. She put them in her personal bag, not her work bag. She straightened the photograph of Dorothy on her desk. Then she stood up, put on her coat, and walked out of the building into the November cold. Her face composed and her eyes clear, and something quiet and certain settling into the space behind her sternum like a foundation being laid. The lake wind hit her on the sidewalk, sharp and without apology. She turned her collar up and walked to her car, her footsteps even and deliberate on the cold pavement. Whatever was coming, she would be ready for it. She had always been good at being ready. The Milwaukee County Courthouse on North 9th Street had a way of absorbing whatever you brought into it. Anxiety, hope, righteous fury. It took all of it into its high-ceilinged corridors and returned something neutral. Something that smelled of industrial floor cleaner and recirculated air. And the particular atmosphere of rooms where decisions got made about people's lives on a Tuesday morning with the efficiency of a municipal schedule. Clara arrived 20 minutes early. She had dressed with care, not performance, nothing that could be read as theater, but care: the gray blazer she wore to depositions, the charcoal slacks. The low heels that she could stand in for hours without noticing. She had slept poorly, but she had slept, and she had eaten breakfast, and she had driven across Milwaukee in the early morning dark. With the radio on low and her hands steady on the wheel. She was prepared. She had been preparing for this since the certified envelope arrived on a Tuesday in November, and maybe, if she was honest with herself, for a very long time before that. Her attorney, a compact, no-nonsense woman named Patricia Oakes, who had been recommended to her by a colleague at the Fraud Control Unit, met her in the lobby and walked her through what to expect. Patricia spoke quickly and used her hands when she talked. And she had the air of someone who had been inside this building so many times that she no longer saw it. Clara found that both reassuring and mildly troubling. "This is preliminary," Patricia said as they walked. "The judge is just establishing scope today. Your only job is to sit there and look like yourself. Which means calm, credible, and professional. Don't react to anything Eleanor says. Don't react to anything their attorney says. If I nudge you, that means keep quiet. If I hand you a note, read it but don't respond to it visibly. Are we clear?" "We're clear," Clara said. The courtroom was smaller than she expected. Wood-paneled walls, fluorescent overhead lights that buzzed faintly at a frequency she could feel in her back teeth. A raised bench at the front where Judge Margaret Hollis would sit. The gallery had perhaps 30 seats, and about half of them were occupied a mix of other parties waiting for other matters, 2 people who might have been reporters, and a handful of faces Clara didn't recognize but whose attention she could feel like pressure against her skin. Eleanor came in 4 minutes after Clara. The years had been administered carefully. That was the only way Clara could describe it, standing there in the aisle and seeing her mother walk through the courtroom door for the first time in 19 years. It looked like someone had applied money and discipline to the problem of aging and come out ahead. Eleanor was 55 and looked 48, in a tailored navy blazer and slacks that had not come off a department store rack. Her dark hair was cut close, professional, authoritative. Her makeup was precise. She moved through the room with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to being looked at. And she was wearing Dorothy's pearl earrings. Clara had last seen those earrings on Dorothy 3 months before her grandmother's death, when Clara had driven up to Eau Claire on a Sunday and they had eaten lunch together at Dorothy's kitchen table, chicken, salad sandwiches and iced tea, and Dorothy had worn those pearls the way she always wore them for company. The triple strand that Harold had given her on their 30th anniversary, luminous and slightly warm against the white of her hair. Clara sat very still and watched Eleanor cross the room to the respondent's table. Behind Eleanor came Arthur Sterling. He was heavy-set and well-dressed in a way that worked hard to communicate respectability. The kind of man who had put serious effort into the construction of an impression. He found his seat in the gallery behind Eleanor's table, and as he settled into it, he turned his face toward Clara. Their eyes met for a moment. He coughed, briefly, a small sound that almost concealed the expression underneath it, a slight, satisfied curve at the corner of his mouth. Almost concealed. Not quite. Clara looked away. The hearing began with the formalities that all hearings begin with, the calling of the case. The establishment of counsel, the judge's brief orientation to the proceedings. Judge Hollis was a woman somewhere in her early 60s, silver-haired and reading glasses at the end of the nose. With the calibrated patience of someone who had heard thousands of stories in this room and retained the capacity to listen to one more without prejudging its outcome. Clara found herself respecting that before the judge had said more than 30 words. Eleanor's attorney, a tall man named Forsyth, spoke first. He was smooth in the manner of someone who had polished smoothness to a specific professional standard. And he outlined Eleanor's position in the measured, regretful tones of a man performing deep concern for a deeply concerning situation. His client had been estranged from her daughter, painfully, regrettably estranged, and had only recently become aware, through the probate process, that Mrs. Dorothy Thorne's final will appeared to represent a significant departure from her previously stated wishes. There were concerns about undue influence. There were concerns about the mental state of the deceased at the time of signing. His client wished to ensure that her own mother's true intentions were honored. Then Eleanor took the stand. What happened in the next 12 minutes was something Clara would think about for a long time afterward, not because of what was said, but because of how it was said, and how it landed in the room. Eleanor's voice broke at the precise right moments. Her eyes filled, not overflowed, just filled in a way that seemed authentic because it was controlled enough to seem unstaged. She spoke about estrangement with the vocabulary of a woman who had grieved it, who had been kept away, who had reached out and been rebuffed. She used the word heartbroken 3 times, each time with a slightly different inflection, as though she had rehearsed the distance between them. My daughter has been unstable since she was a teenager, Eleanor said, and her voice was soft and full of what sounded like sorrow. She turned her face toward Clara as she said it, and her manicured finger came up in a gesture that was halfway between pointing and reaching, halfway between accusation and appeal. I only want what's best for her. I'm her mother. That never stops. The gallery rustled. Whispers moved through the rows like a draft under a door. Clara felt the weight of eyes on her, not hostile, exactly, but assessing, the way people look at something they're trying to categorize, and the category they were reaching for. She knew, was exactly the one Eleanor wanted them to reach for. Patricia's elbow touched Clara's arm, barely perceptible, and Clara did not move, did not shift. Did not allow anything to cross her face beyond a composed and even attention. She kept her eyes on the judge. But she was also watching Eleanor. Or more specifically, she was watching Eleanor's hands, because Clara had spent 11 years watching what people did with their hands. When they were holding something they didn't want seen. Eleanor had a designer handbag on the table beside her, large and structured, and there was something inside it, a document of some kind. The corner of a manila folder just barely visible at the bag's mouth. Every time Judge Hollis leaned forward to write something, every time the judge's attention sharpened and tilted toward the respondent's table, Eleanor's hand moved in a small, casual gesture toward that bag. Adjusting it, repositioning it, keeping it covered. Clara noted it. She noted it the way she noted everything, without visible reaction. The observation stored precisely and without interpretation until she had enough context to know what to do with it. The preliminary hearing concluded without a ruling. Judge Hollis set the date for the full competency proceeding and adjourned. The room began to sort itself out, people standing, gathering papers, the low rumble of professional conversation filling the space where silence had been. Patricia was already writing on her legal pad, talking in a low, rapid voice about next steps and filings and timelines. Clara stood up from the hard wooden bench. Her back ached from holding itself so still for so long. The fluorescent lights were still buzzing faintly at their particular frequency. Across the room, Eleanor was speaking with Forsyth in a tone too low to hear, her hand now resting comfortably over the bag, the contents no longer at risk of being seen. Behind Eleanor, Arthur Sterling was buttoning his jacket. He glanced once more in Clara's direction, and this time there was no cough to hide behind. And the expression on his face was naked and unhurried and entirely certain of itself. It was the expression of a man who believed the outcome was already decided. Who believed he had seen this game played before and knew exactly how it ended. Clara met his gaze and held it for a count of 3. Then she turned to Patricia and said, quietly, I need you to file a request for full discovery on the power of attorney document. And I want the notarization records. Patricia looked at her over the top of her reading glasses. Already on my list. Good, Clara said. She pulled on her coat. The shame that had been pressing against her chest throughout the hearing had not disappeared. She was not so disciplined that she could make it disappear, but it had changed its shape. It was less like a weight now and more like a current, something that moved through her and left direction in its wake. She walked out of the courtroom into the corridor, her footsteps steady on the marble floor, her head level. The building absorbed her composure the way it absorbed everything else, without judgment, without comment. Outside, Milwaukee was gray and cold and going about its business. Clara buttoned her coat all the way to the throat and walked toward the parking structure with her hands steady at her sides. Eau Claire was a 3-hour drive northwest of Milwaukee on a clear day, and the day Clara made it was not clear. The sky was the color of old dishwater, low and close, and by the time she reached the Chippewa River Valley, the clouds had turned to the kind of flat, pewter gray that meant either snow or the serious consideration of snow. She drove with the radio off. She had nothing she wanted to hear. Dorothy's house was on a quiet residential street 3 blocks from a Lutheran church Dorothy had attended for 31 years. It was a small craftsman bungalow, white with green shutters, a covered front porch, a maple in the front yard that had gone leafless and gray. Clara had a key. She had always had a key. Dorothy had pressed a spare into her hand when Clara was 19 and newly at college, and had said simply, in case you need a place to come back to. Clara had never lost it. She'd carried it on her key ring for 14 years, through 3 apartments and 2 job changes. And 1 serious relationship that had ended quietly and without great drama, and the key had always been there. She let herself in. The house smelled of lavender and something else underneath it. Dust, and absence, and the particular quality of air in rooms that haven't been breathed in for a while. The furniture was still there, everything in its place, but the energy that had animated the space, Dorothy's particular presence, the sound of her moving between rooms. The smell of whatever she had last baked that was gone, and its absence was its own kind of presence. Clara stood in the front hall for a moment and then walked back to the kitchen. She didn't know why the kitchen. She knew, distantly, that she should probably be at the office of Patricia Oakes reviewing discovery documents, or at her own apartment in Milwaukee, making calls, or doing any number of the practical, forward-moving things that her situation required. She couldn't do any of those things right now. She had been steady for 23 days since the legal notice arrived. She had been steady at the courthouse. She had been steady at Patricia's office and on the phone with the state fraud unit and in every conversation with Cameron and in the grocery store checkout line. And while sitting in her car outside her frozen account bank branch on a Wednesday afternoon. She had been steady for a very long time, and the steadiness had a cost, and right now. The kitchen of Dorothy's empty house in Eau Claire was where she could afford to pay it. She sat on the linoleum floor. Just sat down, back against the lower cabinet doors, knees pulled toward her chest. The overhead light off because she hadn't turned it on and couldn't quite make herself do it now. Boxes from the estate process were stacked along the far wall. Cardboard with handwritten labels in the neat printing of the estate attorney's paralegal dishes. Linens, books, misk. The kitchen smelled more strongly of lavender here, close to the floor. Dorothy had kept sachets in the lower cabinets, had replaced them every spring, had been doing so since before Clara was born. The smell was so specifically Dorothy that it did something to Clara's chest that she declined to examine too closely. She sat there for a while. The refrigerator was unplugged, its door left slightly open the way you leave things that aren't being used anymore, and in the silence of the house. She could hear nothing but the distant sound of a car passing on the street outside and, once, the creak of the house settling into the cold. It was the sound of a house that was becoming past tense. That had already become past tense. That was held in the present only by the fact of boxes and ownership and a legal process that had not yet reached its conclusion. She was not crying. She was doing the thing that comes before crying that sometimes never becomes crying. The thing where the body recognizes the weight of everything that has accumulated and makes a kind of inventory of it without deciding what to do next. Frozen bank account. Administrative leave. A courtroom gallery watching her mother point a manicured finger and say the word unstable with practiced, performed grief. Dorothy's pearls on Eleanor's ears. Arthur Sterling's expression, unhurried and certain. She reached for the nearest box without thinking, the one labeled Misk, and opened the flap. Inside were the kinds of things that don't fit other categories: a bottle of hand lotion, a stack of Christmas cards tied with twine, a broken wall clock that Dorothy had apparently kept for reasons known only to herself, and a drawer organizer from somewhere in the kitchen's contents, the kind with small partitions. Clara pulled out a manila envelope from the bottom of the box and turned it over. It was from First National Bank, Eau Claire branch. A notice of foreclosure. She read it, and then she read it again. Dorothy's home, the house Clara was currently sitting in, on whose floor she was currently sitting, had been used as collateral for a line of credit. The line of credit had been drawn down to its maximum of $62,000 over a period of 9 months. The payments had been missed for 3 consecutive months before Dorothy's death. The account, now part of the estate, was in default. The line of credit had been applied for in Dorothy's name. The signature on the application was Dorothy's. The proceeds had been wired to an account in the name of Lakeshore Health Partners, LLC. Clara set the foreclosure notice down on the linoleum beside her with great care, the way you set down something fragile. Her phone buzzed in her jacket pocket. She took it out. Cameron. He had been patient, genuinely patient, in the way that was one of the things she had loved about him. When they first met, that particular quality of unhurried steadiness that had felt, after a lifetime of precariousness, like finding level ground. But patience had a shape, and over the past weeks she had been watching its shape change. She read the message. Hey, I've been thinking, maybe your mom is just scared. About losing her own mother, about all the legal stuff. Maybe if you just talked to her, really talked to her, without lawyers, it might be different? Why won't you try that? I just want this to be over for you. Clara looked at the message for a long time. She thought about Eleanor's manicured finger. She thought about Dorothy's pearl earrings on Eleanor's earlobes. She thought about Lakeshore Health Partners LLC and a $62,000 line of credit. And a surgical procedure for a woman who hadn't had surgery because she was afraid of hospitals ever since her husband hadn't come home from one in 1987. She threw the phone. Not across the room exactly, she didn't have the room for it, but hard enough against the cabinet door across from her that it hit with a sharp crack and fell to the linoleum, the screen. A spiderweb of fractures from corner to corner, the case split along one side. The sound bounced off the kitchen walls and faded. The house was very quiet. Clara looked at her hands. They were shaking. She hadn't noticed them starting. She spread them flat against her thighs and pressed down and breathed, and the shaking gradually slowed. She looked at the foreclosure notice. She looked at the boxes stacked along the wall. She looked at her fractured phone screen, Cameron's message still technically readable through the cracks if you knew what you were looking at. She had lost her job access. She had lost her credit. She had lost temporarily, she told herself firmly, her professional standing, the thing she had built out of nothing, out of 14 years of a teenager in a Green Bay apartment learning how to be a person without a mother's help. The thing Eleanor had never contributed 1 hour or $1 toward building, and was now attempting to dismantle through a court proceeding and a law firm. And a husband who left smirks in his wake the way other men left cologne. Am I truly as crazy as she says? The thought came from somewhere low and old, from the part of her that had been 14 years old and watching from a window. She sat with it honestly, the way she sat with every uncomfortable truth, and she examined it, and she turned it over, and she looked at all its sides. No, she was not. She knew what she knew. She knew how to read numbers, and she knew what the numbers said. And she knew that the numbers did not lie, not if you knew how to find where the lies were hiding inside them. She was Clara Thorne, and she was a forensic fraud examiner with 11 years of experience. And she was sitting on the kitchen floor of her grandmother's house in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, in the dark. And she was going to find every piece of it. She picked up the foreclosure notice and folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket. She picked up her shattered phone. She sat there for a few minutes more in the dark and the lavender-scented air, and she breathed, and she let the darkness of the house be what it was, a mirror. Maybe, of the place inside her that had been made when Eleanor left, the hollow that she had spent 19 years building things into. Libraries, credentials, competencies, numbers that made sense, order that held. Then she got up. She turned on the kitchen light. She filled a glass of water at the tap and drank it standing at the sink. Looking out the window at the leafless maple in the backyard, at the pewter sky that had not yet decided what it was going to become. She had work to do. That was the only sentence she needed. Not a battle cry, not a declaration, just the plain, durable statement of a woman who had spent her entire adult life knowing how to find the truth inside. A system designed to make truth findable, if you were patient enough and honest enough to look. She set the glass down in the empty drying rack. She put the foreclosure notice in her coat pocket alongside her keys and her shattered phone. She turned the kitchen light off behind her, and she walked out of the house into the Eau Claire afternoon, pulling the door firmly shut. Well, friends, we are right at the heart of this story, and what a story it has been so far. We've watched Clara, a woman who built everything she has through sheer discipline and quiet determination. Have it all threatened by the one person in the world who should have protected her all along. Her own mother. We've seen her sit in that courthouse and take the weight of those stairs, and then go sit on her grandmother Dorothy's kitchen floor in the dark. Because even the strongest among us can only carry so much before we need a moment to just set it down. But here's what I want you to hold on to. Clara found the foreclosure notice. She asked the right questions. And something is stirring in that empty house that is going to change everything. We are at the turning point, friends. Stay with us. She found the key on a Saturday morning. She had gone back to Dorothy's house to pack the kitchen boxes herself. She needed to be doing something with her hands. Something concrete and finite, and she was working through the lower cabinet beside the stove when she found the old pill organizer. It was the kind that came from a pharmacy, pale blue plastic, with compartments labeled for each day of the week. Dorothy had kept a spare one. Clara remembered that now, remembered Dorothy saying once that she kept an extra in the kitchen in case she ever couldn't make it to the bathroom in the morning. Which had seemed at the time like the kind of modest, practical planning that Dorothy applied to every corner of her life. The Monday compartment was empty, as expected. So was Tuesday. Wednesday contained not a pill but a small brass key, the kind with a number stamped on it. 447 and a tag attached with a rubber band that read, in Dorothy's careful handwriting, First National, Eau Claire. Clara sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long moment. Then she drove to First National Bank. The safe deposit box was in a vault room lined with metal drawers. Cool and quiet and smelling of climate-controlled air and old metal, the atmosphere of a room designed to preserve things against time. Box 447 was in the second row. Clara opened it with the brass key and the attendant's master key simultaneously. The way the protocol required, and carried the box to the private viewing room. Inside was a leather-bound journal and a bundle of receipts and documents held together with a rubber band. Dorothy's handwriting was in the journal the same careful print as the tag on the key, but slower in places, the letters formed with more deliberate effort. The hand of someone whose joints ached but who had insisted on legibility anyway. Clara turned to the first entry. It was dated 14 months before Dorothy's death. Eleanor came today. She brought flowers, yellow ones, which she knew I always liked. She was very sweet. She held my hand and cried a little and said she wanted to make things right. I was glad to see her, I won't pretend I wasn't. A mother doesn't stop being glad to see her child, no matter what has happened. But she brought papers. Clara turned pages. She was asking me to sign things. Documents about my accounts. She called them routine. She said it was so she could help me manage things if I ever needed help. She was very patient and very kind while she explained it. My hand was shaking the way it does now. I signed some of them. I don't think I should have. Clara pressed a palm flat against the journal page. More entries. Over the months that followed, Dorothy had been documenting. Not every day. Some weeks the journal went silent, but she came back to it. Came back with the particular tenacity of a woman who wanted someone to know what was happening, who needed to put it somewhere safe and true. She had noticed the withdrawals. She had asked Eleanor about them and received answers that were smooth and reassuring and left her feeling uneasy in a way she couldn't pin down. She had noticed Arthur, how he always stayed close, how he sometimes answered questions she had directed at Eleanor. Then, near the end of the journal, an entry that stopped Clara's breath. I found the notary stamp in the side table drawer. I don't know who Ray Gustafson is, but Arthur left it there when he visited Tuesday and didn't notice when he left without it. I put it in the journal because Clara will know what to do with something like that. She's always known how to find the truth inside a number. She gets that from Harold. The notary stamp was there. Inside a small envelope tucked between the journal's back cover and its binding. Clara opened it carefully. It was the kind of rubber stamp used to notarize documents, the kind that leaves an embossed impression. The name read Ray Gustafson, Notary Public, State of Wisconsin. Clara had the name already, from her preliminary research. She had noted it and flagged it and not yet had time to fully pursue it. She knew what she would find when she did. She could feel the shape of it the way she felt the shape of fraudulent billing patterns, the particular configuration of deliberate wrongdoing. Dorothy had not been confused. Dorothy had not been a woman in cognitive decline being gently steered by a loving daughter. Dorothy had been a woman with shaking hands and clear eyes, watching what was being done to her, documenting it in a leather journal. Hiding a brass key in a pill organizer, leaving everything for the granddaughter she trusted with the truth. The cold of the vault room felt like a breath of clarity. Clara sat in the small, private room with the journal open on the table and the rubber stamp in her hand and the receipts spread around her, and she felt two things simultaneously: grief. Clean and deep, for the woman who had done all of this alone. And something else sharp and certain and rising that she recognized as the moment when a case stops being abstract and becomes personal in the truest sense of the word. Dorothy had thrown her a lifeline from the other side. Clara intended to catch it. She worked for 72 hours with minimal sleep, and the apartment she had rented month to month since the freeze on her primary residence's utilities went through. Looked, by the end of it, less like a living space and more like a situation room. The kitchen table had disappeared under printed spreadsheets, bank records pulled from the estate's discovery documents. The journal, the receipts, and a timeline that she had been building and rebuilding on a large piece of drafting paper taped to the wall. She had made a pot of coffee at 11 on Saturday night, and by Sunday afternoon she had made 3 more. And at some point she had eaten a bowl of cereal because the evidence of it was on the counter, though she had no specific memory of doing so. She worked with the methodical focus that she had trained herself to maintain across long cases. The ability to suspend interpretation while accumulating data, to hold the discomfort of incomplete pattern and not rush toward a conclusion before the evidence supported it. This case was not incomplete. The pattern was there. She had seen it before in other files, in other names, and she knew its shape the way a doctor knows the shape of a familiar pathology. Not with satisfaction, but with the bleak recognition of something encountered too many times already. The thing about financial fraud, when you knew how to look at it, was that it left marks the way footprints leave marks, not always obvious. Not always where you first looked, but consistent in character, because people who commit fraud tend to commit it the same way every time. They find a method that works and they trust it, and that trust in the method is ultimately the thing that undoes them. Arthur Sterling trusted his method. He had used it before. Clara could see it now, in the records she had assembled. His first wife, a woman named Patricia Dowell Sterling, had died in 2016 with an estate that should have been worth considerably more than the probate records showed. The attorney of record on that estate had been at Hartley, Sims and Kowalski. The notary on the power of attorney document had been Ray Gustafson. She ran Ray Gustafson's commission records through the Wisconsin Secretary of State's notary database. The results came back clean, which meant he was currently commissioned. She ran them again with the historical filter. Ray Gustafson's notarial commission had been revoked in 2019. Following a complaint filed by the Racine County Clerk's Office regarding irregularities in documents he had notarized in connection with 2 real estate transactions. He had not reapplied for commission. His commission had been gone for 5 years, and he had apparently been using the stamp anyway, for clients who presumably didn't verify and didn't ask. Dorothy's power of attorney document was dated 2024, and bore Ray Gustafson's stamp. She stared at that for a long time, letting it settle into place. A notary who lost his commission in 2019 had supposedly notarized a document in 2024. The document was fraudulent on its face. Every transaction conducted under its authority was void. Every withdrawal, every wire transfer, every use of Dorothy's financial identity that flowed from that document was not power of attorney action. It was theft. She cross-referenced Arthur's business registrations with the financial records. Lakeshore Health Partners, LLC. She ran the Medicare billing records she had saved from her own case files before her credentials were suspended, the EOB from the surgery Dorothy never had. She ran it against the provider registration for Lakeshore. She tracked the reimbursement $6,420 wired to Lakeshore's operating account, withdrawn in cash over 3 transactions 2 days later. Then she went wider, pulling what she could from the estate discovery documents and the publicly available records from Arthur's laundromat venture in Racine. 3 locations, all closed, all in default. By the time she added everything together, the number was $47,850. That was how much Arthur Sterling had taken from Dorothy Thorne across 14 months. By way of a fraudulent power of attorney notarized by a man whose commission didn't exist. Billed through a shell company whose only apparent function was to receive and launder money from vulnerable elderly account holders. She wrote the number in the center of the timeline in red ink and circled it twice. Then she sat back and looked at it for a long moment. $47,850. A year of payments on Dorothy's home. A decade of insurance premiums. A number with a face behind it. Dorothy at the kitchen table, handshaking. Trusting the wrong person because she wanted, as all mothers and grandmothers want, to believe that blood was something you could count on. Clara drew a single line from the circled number to the name Arthur Sterling at the top of the timeline. Then she capped the marker and moved on. The rain started sometime Sunday evening, coming in off the lake in the way Milwaukee rained as in late autumn. Sideways and persistent, streaking the apartment windows. Clara was still at the table when her phone buzzed with a text from a number she had saved 3 weeks ago. The text read, "I need to talk to you. Not on the phone. Can you meet me?" It was from Merlin. Merlin was 29, Arthur's stepdaughter from his first marriage, the daughter of Patricia Dowell Sterling. Clara had found her through the probate records, had left a careful, measured voicemail 3 weeks ago. Explaining who she was and what she was trying to establish. She had not expected a response. She texted back when and where. They met in the parking lot of a hardware store near the interstate, 40 minutes north of the city, on a Monday evening. When the rain had settled into a steady, uniform gray that turned the parking lot lights into halos. Merlin was small and sharp-eyed, with her mother's coloring. And something in her jaw that suggested she had been carrying a specific anger for a long time and had grown accustomed to its weight. She did not get out of her car. Clara walked up to the driver's side window, and Merlin rolled it down halfway. "I don't know if this helps," Merlin said. She took out her phone and pulled up a recording. "He doesn't know I have this. I was in the next room. He was on the phone with somebody I don't know who. This was back in September." She pressed play. The audio quality was imperfect, ambient room noise underneath, but Arthur Sterling's voice was clear enough. "Daughter's a problem, but that's manageable. The competency angle is airtight if she keeps her mouth shut. She's the crazy kid who chased her mother out of her life. Nobody's going to take her word over Eleanor's in a courtroom. Courts love a tearful mother." A pause. Then, "The forensic thing is what I told you about. She's on leave, her credentials are suspended, and once the petition goes through, anything she produces is going to look like exactly what it is, a desperate woman trying to save herself. Trust me, we've done this before." Merlin stopped the recording. Clara was quiet for a moment, listening to the rain on the car roof. The parking lot lights made halos in the steady drizzle. "This ends now," Clara said. Her voice was entirely steady. Steadier, if anything, than she had been in weeks, the steadiness that comes not from suppression, but from clarity, from knowing exactly what you are doing and why. "I want you to know this ends now, and it won't only help me. Merlin looked at her through the half-open window for a long moment. The rain was steady on the car roof, the lot lights making soft halos in the wet air. She looked like someone who had been waiting a long time to hear those words, or words like them. Someone who had practiced not expecting them and had been caught by surprise anyway. "My mother's estate," she said. "We'll get there," Clara said. "Let me do this first." Back at the apartment, the rain still hitting the windows, she organized everything with the systematic precision she brought to every case that mattered. The journal, the fraudulent notary stamp, the timeline, the commission records showing Gustafson's 2019 revocation, the Medicare billing records for the phantom surgery, the bank wire records to Lakeshore, the financial reconstruction showing the $47,850. The recording. She had a large, black 3-ring binder, the kind she used for her most complex cases. She printed everything in order, organized it with numbered tabs, wrote a table of contents on the cover sheet in her smallest, clearest handwriting. She labeled it in clean block letters on the spine Thorne estate fraud documentation. She set the binder on the table, closed it, and pressed her palm flat against the cover. The rain was still coming in off the lake. Inside, the apartment was warm, and the only light was the lamp on the table, and Clara's hands were not shaking. They hadn't shaken in 3 days. They were ready. She clicked her pen once, twice, the sound small and certain in the quiet room, and she was ready. The morning of the final hearing arrived with the kind of cold clarity that late November sometimes produces in Wisconsin. The sky an absolute blue, the air sharp and clean and merciless, the sun low and very bright, throwing long shadows across the courthouse steps and making everything look outlined and definitive. Clara arrived early. She arrived with Patricia Oakes and with the black binder. And with the composed, settled quality of someone who had done the work, who knew the work was good, and who was prepared for whatever came next. She did not eat breakfast. She had a thermos of coffee, which she finished in Patricia's car in the parking structure. And she felt the caffeine settle into her bloodstream like a second preparation alongside the first. Eleanor and Forsyth were already in the courtroom when they entered. Eleanor was speaking quietly with her attorney, her posture arranged in the posture of someone who expects to win. Relaxed without being careless, attentive without being anxious. She had dressed for the occasion charcoal gray today, silk at the collar, the navy blazer replaced by something that communicated a different tone. Measured, maternal, reasonable. She was speaking to a reporter from one of the local papers. As Clara took her seat, the words pitched carefully at the edge of audibility, something about the difficulty of family estrangement, the heartbreak of watching a child struggle. Clara did not look at her. She opened her binder to the first tab and reviewed her notes one final time. Arthur Sterling took his seat in the gallery with his Sunday best gravity. No smirk today, nothing visible on his face at all, the blank expression of someone who has learned that expressions are evidence and has disciplined his accordingly. He crossed one leg over the other and folded his hands in his lap. Judge Hollis entered at 9 on the hour, and the room organized itself. Forsyth's opening statement was a variation on the preliminary hearings themes of vulnerable elderly woman. A daughter too close to her own financial interests, the sanctity of Dorothy's true wishes, the need for proper oversight of an estate that had possibly been manipulated. He used the words unfortunately and regrettably with significant frequency. He used the word stability in reference to Clara in a tone that made the word carry something other than its literal meaning. Then Judge Hollis turned to Patricia, who stood and said, "Your Honor, my client will be presenting material evidence directly bearing on the authenticity of the power of attorney document central to this proceeding. We request that the court treat Ms. Thorne as an expert witness in forensic fraud examination." Forsyth objected. Judge Hollis considered. Judge Hollis overruled. Clara took the stand. She arranged herself in the chair with the deliberate, undemonstrative composure of a professional in a professional setting. She had sat in witness chairs before, in depositions, in federal fraud proceedings, in small claims hearings, where she had served as an expert and the opposing attorney had tried to rattle her with questions about her methodology. She had never been rattled. The methodology was sound. The evidence was the evidence. The numbers said what they said, and all the cross-examination in the world could not make them say something else. She was not at this moment, in this chair, with the gallery watching and Eleanor's eyes on her and the fluorescent lights buzzing at their familiar frequency. The child who had waited by a window in Green Bay for 3 days. She was not the woman who had sat on the kitchen floor in Eau Claire in the dark. She was the person she had made herself into by 11 years of patient, disciplined, honest work, and she took the stand carrying all of it with her. She began with the Notary Commission. Wisconsin Statute 140.05 requires that all notarial acts be performed by a commissioned notary public, she said, her voice clear and even. The power of attorney document filed by the petitioner bears the stamp of Ray Gustafson, identified as a notary public for the state of Wisconsin. I obtained Mr. Gustafson's commission records from the Wisconsin Secretary of State's office. She opened the binder to tab 3 and handed the document to the court clerk. Mr. Gustafson's notarial commission was revoked in April of 2019. It has not been reinstated. The power of attorney document bearing his stamp is dated March of 2024. Mr. Gustafson had no legal authority to notarize any document at that time. The power of attorney is void on its face. The room was very quiet. Judge Hollis had leaned forward in the way she had at the preliminary hearing, the slight forward tilt, the eyes sharpening, the reading glasses moved from the end of her nose to her hand. Clara continued. She walked through the Medicare billing fraud, the surgery Dorothy never had, the Lakeshore billing code, the wire transfer to the Lakeshore operating account, the cash withdrawals. She presented the financial reconstruction of the $47,850 each transaction, each date, each mechanism described in plain language that the gallery could follow, and that the court reporter was capturing in its entirety. She spoke without flourish, without dramatic pause, without anything beyond the steady, measured delivery of a professional, presenting evidence that was what it was and needed nothing added to it. She presented Dorothy's journal, entering it into evidence as a contemporaneous personal record, tab 7 through tab 14, Dorothy's handwriting, Dorothy's careful documentation of her own betrayal. She looked up once, partway through, and saw Eleanor's face. The performance had ended. What was there instead was something much simpler. A pale, stripped look, the face of someone watching the machinery they believed was running in their favor reverse direction without warning. Eleanor's hands were pressed flat against the table in front of her. Her attorney was writing rapidly on his legal pad. Behind Eleanor, in the gallery, Arthur Sterling had uncrossed his legs and leaned forward. And the blankness he had maintained all morning was cracking at the edges. Clara reached tab 15. She took out the recording Merlin had provided, authenticated it through the chain of custody documentation she had prepared, and had it entered into the record. She provided the court clerk with a written transcript. She asked for it to be played. Arthur Sterling's voice filled the courtroom. The crazy kid who chased her mother out of her life. Nobody's going to take her word over Eleanor's in a courtroom. In the gallery, Arthur Sterling rose from his seat. Mr. Sterling, Judge Hollis said, in the tone of a woman who has been in courtrooms for 3 decades and does not require a second attempt, you will sit down. He sat down. The recording continued to its end. The room absorbed it. Then the room was very quiet again, and in that quiet Clara heard or imagined she heard, or felt more than heard something release. Some held thing in the air around her, the particular sound of an ending. Judge Hollis wrote for a long time. The silver of her hair caught the fluorescent light, and her pen moved steadily across the page, and no one in the courtroom spoke. Then the judge looked up. The petition for a determination of legal incompetency is denied with prejudice. Her voice was measured and entirely without inflection, the voice of a ruling, not a performance. The court finds that the power of attorney document central to the petitioner's claims is fraudulent on its face. Having been notarized by an individual without legal commission, all financial transactions conducted under its authority are void. The estate of Dorothy May Thorne shall be administered according to her final, validly executed will. She looked directly at Eleanor, then at Arthur, for a moment that required no additional words. The court is referring the matter of the fraudulent power of attorney, the associated financial transactions, and the Medicare billing irregularities to the United States Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Wisconsin for review of potential federal fraud charges. The bailiffs were already moving. Eleanor's face had gone through pale and was now something beyond pale. A grayish, hollowed quality, the face of someone from whom a very specific kind of certainty has just been permanently removed. She looked, for a moment, directly at Clara, and Clara looked back, and whatever was exchanged in that moment was not forgiveness and was not triumph and was not grief, exactly, it was something more like recognition. Clear and final, the moment when a question that has been open for 19 years gets answered at last. Clara thought of Dorothy's journal. She thinks I don't see the papers she's sliding onto the table. Dorothy had seen them. She had written it down in a leather-bound journal and hidden a brass key in a pill organizer and trusted that her granddaughter would know exactly what to do. And Clara had known. She had known because Dorothy had spent 50 years teaching her, by example and by presence and by the simple, daily act of being someone who believed that careful attention to the truth was the most important work a person could do, regardless of whether anyone was watching or whether any institution affirmed it. Today, the court wrote in ink what Dorothy's hand had already written. What Clara's heart had been shouting in the silence of a frozen bank account and a hard courtroom bench and a kitchen floor in the dark. Today it was written in ink, and it was done. She gathered her binder. She clipped her pen to its cover. She thanked Patricia Oakes quietly, and Patricia gripped her arm once, briefly, the gesture of a professional who doesn't do gestures easily. Around them the courtroom was beginning to move again, the bailiffs with Eleanor. Forsyth gathering his documents with the controlled efficiency of a man managing a professional catastrophe, the court reporter closing her stenography machine, the gallery murmuring and shifting. Clara stood in the middle of it and let it happen around her. She did not feel triumphant. She had expected to feel triumphant and she didn't, which was something she filed away to think about later. What she felt instead was a kind of clarity, the particular quality of air in a room when a long, sustained noise finally stops. The proceeding that had been building since November, the frozen accounts and the administrative leave and the courtroom gallery and Eleanor's pointed finger. All of it had resolved into a judge's ruling and a referral for federal charges and a bailiff's movement across a polished courtroom floor. And now it was done, and the clarity of that was immense. She walked out of the courtroom and into the clear, cold, absolutely blue Wisconsin morning. She was back at her desk on a Monday morning in December. Gerald Reardon met her at the building entrance himself. He had never met her at the building entrance before, in 11 years, and the gesture was not lost on her. He shook her hand with both of his and said, "I owe you an apology. The department owes you an apology." She told him she appreciated it, and she meant it, and they walked in together through the lobby and up the elevator in the companionable quiet of two people who understood each other well enough not to require additional words. Her office was exactly as she had left it. The case files, the monitors, the color-coded cross-reference system. The ceramic mug. Dorothy's photograph. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at it, and then she walked to her chair and sat down and turned her computer on. And the familiar soft chime of the login screen was unexpectedly, embarrassingly one of the most welcome sounds she had heard in weeks. She was reinstated with full credentials. The administrative leave had been formally expunged from her record. Gerald had attached a personal letter to her personnel file commending her handling of the circumstances. Which was more than she had asked for and less than the circumstances deserved, but she understood bureaucracy well enough to know that it was, on the scale of institutional acknowledgement, substantial. She did not go directly into her case files. She sat for a few minutes with her coffee hot, this time, actually hot. Which she was going to take as a sign of something, and looked at Dorothy's photograph. She had been to the house in Eau Claire one more time since the hearing. She had gone on a Saturday, not to pack boxes but simply to be there, to move through the rooms and let the house be a house and not a crime scene. She had sat on the back porch in the cold for almost an hour, wrapped in Dorothy's old green cardigan that she had found hanging behind the bathroom door. The maple tree in the backyard was completely bare now, and the Chippewa River Valley was white with the first real snow of the season, and the sky was the color of pewter, and it was very quiet, and it was in a way she hadn't expected and didn't yet know how to fully name. Okay. Not good, not resolved, in any clean or complete way. But okay, which was, she had come to believe, often the most honest and durable form of good. She had the pearl earrings in her coat pocket. They had been returned to the estate following the ruling, along with the other personal effects that had been removed. Patricia had called her when they were available to collect. Clara had driven to the attorney's office on a Tuesday afternoon and signed the receipt form. And put the earrings in her coat pocket, and worn them in the car on the drive home, and worn them again on the back porch at Dorothy's house in the cold. And she was wearing them now, sitting at her desk in her office in Milwaukee on a Monday morning in December. They were exactly as she remembered them. Slightly warm against the side of her face. Luminous in the way that old pearls are luminous. The document had come from the Wisconsin Attorney General's Charitable Trust Division, and from her own attorney, and from the estate's final accounting, which Patricia had completed with characteristic efficiency. It established the Dorothy May Thorne Fund for Elder Financial Protection, administered through a partnership between the state's Adult Protective Services Division and a coalition of legal aid organizations serving seniors across Wisconsin. The fund's initial endowment came from the recovered portions of the estate what had been returned after the void transactions were unwound, and from a separate civil settlement that had been negotiated quickly and quietly. Because Arthur Sterling's attorney, when presented with the full evidentiary package, had declined to go to trial. Merlin had been part of that settlement too, though under a separate civil proceeding. The funds recovered from Patricia Dowell Sterling's estate the amount that could be documented and traced. Which was not everything but was something had been restored to Merlin's accounts. Clara had spoken with her by phone on a Tuesday evening, and the conversation had been brief. But it had been real, two women who had never met talking across the particular shared experience of having had the same man try to take something irreplaceable from them. The fund would provide legal representation and forensic financial review for elderly Wisconsinites who suspected they were being exploited. It would be free to them. It would be staffed in part by law students and accounting graduates who wanted the experience, and supervised by certified practitioners. Clara had a pen in her hand, the same pen she used for everything, a medium point black roller that she kept in the front pocket of her work bag and replaced every 6 weeks with mathematical regularity. She looked at the signature line. Clara E. Thorne, founder. She signed her name. It looked the way it always looked, clear. Composed, with the slight leftward lean that all her signatures had, the characteristic that handwriting analysts sometimes associated with careful reserve. It looked exactly like her name. And for the first time in what felt like a very long time. For the first time since a certified envelope had arrived on a Tuesday morning and changed the air in her office, it felt like hers. Not Eleanor's shadow. Not the absent daughter of a woman who had preferred to leave. Not the unstable, unreliable person described in a courtroom before a gallery of whispering strangers. Clara Thorne, forensic fraud examiner. Clara Thorne, who had taught herself to be steady in unsteady conditions. Clara Thorne, whose grandmother had hidden a brass key in a pill organizer and trusted her with the truth. Because she knew her granddaughter would know what to do with it. She signed the document and set her pen down. That evening she drove to Cameron's house. He was standing in the kitchen when she came in, and he looked at her in the way he had been looking at her for the last 2 weeks. With the expression of a man who understood, now, what he hadn't understood before, and was prepared to say so clearly. She set her bag by the door and he came toward her and held her, and they didn't say anything for a while. Sometimes nothing needs to be said. Sometimes the holding is the thing. Later, they went to Dorothy's house together. Cameron had a thermos of hot chocolate that he'd made while she was driving from the office. And they sat on the porch together as the Wisconsin sky turned through its early evening colors, amber and rose and gold. The light that comes just before the long blue dusk of a December evening, painting the snow on the yard in shades that had no proper names. Clara held the warm thermos in both hands. The pearl earrings were cool and smooth against the side of her face. The maple tree was bare against the colored sky. Old age is not a dead end. She had thought that, standing in a courtroom with a black binder in her hands, and it was still true now, sitting on a porch in the evening cold. It is not a dead end. It is a chapter that needs protecting. She had given a part of her career to protecting it before she knew it was personal. Before she knew that the numbers she was learning to read were also the numbers of someone she loved. She would give the rest of it in Dorothy's name. She looked at her signature on the document in her coat pocket, folded there, plain and certain. For the first time in years, her name felt like something she had made entirely for herself, not inherited, not assigned, not contested. Something she had built, letter by letter, decision by decision, through every morning she had gotten up and done the work. A signature. A record. Her own. The sky darkened by degrees. Cameron refilled her cup without being asked. The snow in Dorothy's yard held the last of the light, patient and bright, the way good things hold on when everything else fades. She thought about the girls who would come after. The women who were right now sitting in their own grandmother's houses, or their own mother's houses, in some small city in Wisconsin or Iowa or Ohio, with a document they didn't understand. And a creeping certainty that something was wrong and no one to help them name it. The fund would not save all of them. Nothing would save all of them. But some of them, the ones who found their way to a legal aid office with a number in the directory. The ones whose granddaughters happened to be paying attention, some of them would be okay. Some of them would have what Dorothy had tried to give Clara, the truth in writing, in a place that could not be taken. Friends, how did you find today's story? I have to tell you, this one stayed with me. Clara Thorne walked into this story carrying 19 years of silence, 19 years of a door closed by someone who was supposed to love her, and she built a life in spite of that. Not because the wound healed cleanly, but because she made something out of the honesty of it. She made herself good at finding the truth, and when the truth finally came for her personally, she was ready. That is not a small thing. That is a whole life's worth of preparation. What moved me most was Dorothy. That woman, with her shaking hands and her clear eyes, sitting in that house in Eau Claire. Watching what was being done to her and writing it all down in a leather journal and hiding a brass key in a pill organizer because she knew her granddaughter would know what to do. That is faith. That is love that outlasts everything, even the body that carried it. There's something this story says that I think we all need to hear sometimes. It is never too late to stand for what is true. It doesn't matter how long the wrong has gone on. It doesn't matter how powerful the people doing it believe themselves to be. One woman, one binder, one pen, and the truth gets written in the record, permanently, in ink. We all face moments in our lives when we're asked, in one way or another, who we really are. When something that belongs to us, our name, our reputation, our peace, gets put in someone else's hands, and we have to decide whether to let it stay there. Clara decided, and she didn't decide with anger, in the end. She decided with preparation, with evidence, with the patient, methodical courage of a woman who had been learning how to do exactly this for 11 years. Without knowing that one day she would need it for herself. I hope this story brought you something today, a little comfort, maybe, or a little fire. A reminder that the truth has a way of finding its moment, if there's someone willing to hold it long enough. Thank you so much for spending this time with us. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe and hit that like button. It means everything to us, and it helps more people find these stories. We'll see you next time, friends.